it's going to squeak. All right. Thank you, every one of you, for coming here today. We have Reverend Dr. Jeffrey Kloha will be our speaker. He is speaking on behalf, he is brought in on behalf of the Young Adult Service Area of the South Dakota District. He will speak about the Bible, books, translations, and texts, and specifically with the New Testament. So we're very glad to have him here. I wasn't sure how to introduce him, so I typed up something. And by that I mean I copied and pasted this from the Museum of the Bible's profile on you. All right, yeah, so Reverend Dr. Jeffrey Kloha joined the Museum of the Bible in the summer of 2017, manages day-to-day operations of the Museum of the Bible Collections Department, is responsible for executing, this is boring, the department strategic plan and collection management policies, along with managing other professionals. Previously, Dr. Kloha served 18 years as professor of New Testament at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis, the final 4 years serving as Provost and Chief Academic Officer. During that time, he oversaw 2 accreditation processes, moved them to a new curriculum, and also had to approve and advise me in writing a thesis, which did get done and passed. So God be praised. Received your PhD.
Is that in my bio?
What? That's not in your bio. I added that part. That's a scribal addition. Yeah. He received the PhD from the University of Leeds, researching textual history on the Pauline epistles, specifically 1 Corinthians. Earned MDiv, STM degrees from Concordia Seminary in St. Louis. Areas of teaching and research include the textual and canonical history of early Christian writings, hermeneutics, and the Pauline epistles. Co-editor of a bunch of books, published peer-reviewed articles, frequent conference presenter such as today, radio guest and television documentary commentary. Reverend Dr. Jeffrey Kloha has 6 years of pastoral experience at Gethsemane Lutheran Church in Cleveland, Ohio. Married to Susan, together they have 2 daughters, Taylor and Gabby, and he is an avid Chicago Cubs fan. Please help welcome me, Reverend Dr. Jeffrey Kloha.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out tonight. For those of you who are at Lakota and Crestbard this morning, the Cubs won today 9-0. Just want to let you know. And I wasn't even wearing the t-shirt, so that was good. I lost my computer. So thanks, Tim, for the introduction. And let me get this set up here. Great to be with you here tonight, if I got this to work. Okay, good, good. Thanks. Yeah, it's been a privilege to serve at the seminary and now this last year with the museum. But what we're here to talk about tonight specifically is to get an overview, really, of the history of the New Testament. What came together as what we now call the New Testament? What's the information we have? What's the data? What are the facts? And the reason I think this is becoming more and more important is because there's just more information out there. Find things on the internet, TV shows, specials, documentaries, all talking about the Bible, new discoveries. So how does this fit together? What do we know about how the New Testament came together? And really tonight we're going to look primarily from a historical perspective. What do we know based on just factual evidence, artifacts, manuscripts, things like that? What were people saying about the writings of the New Testament from the beginning? And how does that shape and determine what we have today? All right. And at the end, we'll talk a bit about translations and what are some of the issues involved in modern translations, and most importantly, how do you use a translation, right? Why do we read it? So I'm going to cover a lot of ground tonight, and we'll stop and take questions after each section. But I want to at least give you a bit of an overview for each area. I want to start off by pointing out that these are not new questions. Right? Even though these are now things you see on the TV or news articles, whatever, they're not new questions at all. Theologians, pastors in the history of the church have been trying to deal with and understand and use texts of the Bible from the very beginning. One of my favorite examples is a church father named Augustine, who lived in North Africa in about the year 400. One of the church's most famous early theologians, did a lot of writing, a lot of preaching, a lot of teaching, and he wrestled quite a bit with the Bible, how to interpret it properly, and how to use a translation, because he's working in Latin, whereas the Old Testament is written in Hebrew, the New Testament in Greek. So Augustine is trying to understand what is this thing called the Bible and how do we use it. He has this great quote in a letter that he's writing to a fellow theologian that I think gives a helpful perspective on how to approach things. So he says, "I've learned to yield respect and honor only to the canonical books of Scripture. Of these alone do I most firmly believe that the authors were completely free from error." Sorry, gotta remember to click ahead. Maybe can you give me a click? All right, there we go. There it is. So the canonical books of Scripture, of these alone do I most firmly believe that the authors were completely free from error. And if in these writings I am perplexed by anything which appears to me opposed to the truth, I do not hesitate to suppose that either, and those three things here, either the manuscript is faulty, or the translator has not caught the meaning of what was said, or, the most likely of the three, I myself have failed to understand it. So notice he has an interesting approach, right? He assumes, because it's canonical Scripture, to use his word, because it's the Bible, he's going to assume that it's right, right? That's his role, is to receive it and to assume that it's right. And if something doesn't seem right as he's reading along, he assumes either the copyist made a mistake, because these are made by hand, or the translator made a mistake, or he doesn't understand it himself. So I think it's a helpful starting point to realize that there's both some humility involved in these discussions, and also awareness that these are actual physical objects that were used, passed on. People were involved in making them, people were involved in translating them, people were involved in interpreting them. And this has been what the church has been doing for a very long time. So how did we get the Bible? And let me start with maybe an illustration. Again, I'll ask you to click. There we go. Oh, it skipped a slide. Could you go back one? Sorry, we'll get the tech figured out here. There we go. That's not the Bible, right? You guys remember, anybody know what that thing on the left is? Or either of them, right? Oh, you do, really? You're like 8 years old. How do you know that? Right?
He's been to a museum.
He's been to a museum, yeah. So a floppy disk, right? And so how much did that thing hold? Was it like 360K? Oh, come on, all right. You just know what it is, right? So remember these things? You stuck these in your computer, you closed the door, and it held like 3 words, and then you had to swap out and put another one in, right? And then he invented the bigger one or the smaller one with like 3 times the size, and you could put a whole, paragraph on it. There's a technological leap that allowed you to put more data on the material, right? And then you go to a hard drive and it multiplies. Well, in some ways, that's a bit of a metaphor for how the Bible came together. There's a role that technology played in the formation of the Bible. They are producing copies with physical material that has limitations as to how big you can make something, right? They're making books, codices, out of, well, let me give you the picture here, out of papyrus, which is a fairly thick material, and you can only fold so many pages together before it gets too big and you run out of space. That's a limit, right? That's a limit to how much you could put inside a book and say, this is the New Testament, or this is the Old Testament, right? There's a limit to that. And then in the 4th century, when they start using a different material, vellum, you can make larger pages, and you can fit more material into the book. So we're going to talk today a bit about codices. That's those things on the screen right now. Codices, codex is simply a fancy word for a book. It's pages folded together, and you notice there's a certain size format limitation to what you can put together. Well, that's how the New Testament was transmitted for the first 1,500 years of the church's life, right? So what do you put inside the covers becomes the question, right? And we're used to something like this, right? One book, all bound together, says Holy Bible on the cover. And inside are 66 books, right? Always in the same order, right? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, get the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, right? Always the same books, always the same order, right? Now, that format of the Bible has actually only existed since the early 19th century. It's about 1805, 1808 that British and foreign Bible societies started producing Bibles with only 66 books in it because they wanted to save shipping costs as they shipped it overseas. And so they used only what we now call the books of the Old and New Testament. Prior to that, there was larger Bibles with what we today call the Apocrypha, which is still used by the Roman Catholic Church, Eastern Orthodox Church, still uses a larger set of books. And in fact, the King James Bible had these additional books. Right? So it's only been for the last 200 years that we've had this 66-book list. And all you confirmation kids are thinking, man, 66 books is hard enough to memorize, right? Forget the other ones, okay? So that question has been around for a while, for a good 400, 500 years. Nowadays, we're finding other writings and other sort of editions, if you will, of the Bible. So you see titles like the Lost Books of the Bible, which of course raises the question, who lost them and why? Okay, we'll talk a little bit about that. Or something like this, the Lost Bible, Forgotten Scriptures Revealed, right? With the intimation that, well, there's something out there that we lost and now we should recover, right? Or if you've heard of the Gospel of Thomas, New Perspectives on Jesus' Message is the subtitle to this Gospel of Thomas. We'll talk about that briefly. Or this just came out a couple years ago, an interesting title to a book. Oh, Gospel of Judas. We'll talk about that briefly. Did you guys hear about this, by the way, 2007? We'll cover that briefly. And then this came out, a New Testament. So a really New Testament. And again, a Bible for the 21st century, combining traditional and newly discovered texts. Okay. So how did we end up with the New Testaments that we have? What are these other writings? Who used them? Who produced them? And what's their relationship to what we today call the New Testament? Okay. So a couple things to keep in mind. First, we do have to consider things from a couple sides. I mean, first, there is simply history, right? There are manuscripts. There are examples of people talking about what's in the Bible or using the Bible in a certain way for 1,500 years. There's just historical data that needs to be considered. Second thing to consider is what's the content? What are the theological issues at stake, right? Because as we all know, people can make mistakes, right? There's opinions, there's views of things. And so how do we look at things historically? How do we look at things theologically? What actually happened and why did they do what they did? Now again, we need to keep in mind that when you open your Bible to the table of contents, that's not in the Bible, right? Genesis 1:1 is not the table of contents, right? There is nowhere in the canonical writings provided any list of books. Or you get to the end of the book of Revelation and it doesn't say, oh, by the way, these are the 66 books that are supposed to be in the Bible, right? So the process of putting this together, again, happened historically, And nowhere in the scriptures is there a list provided of what books to read. And again, as I said earlier, the Bible, as we know it today, did not exist as a single book, 39 Old Testament, 27 New Testament, until the 19th century. Okay, so there's historical data here that we need to understand. So why are there questions about this now? And why is this? Why can this potentially be somewhat confusing and easy to get people worked up? Well, first of all, and this is fairly obvious, the Old Testament written in Hebrew, New Testament written in Greek, they're ancient languages, they're difficult to understand, there's these old manuscripts that are difficult to access, they're written 2,000 years ago and more, so it's just old stuff, right? They're difficult languages to master and understand what was going on in the first place. Second thing is, it might be fairly obvious, but the Bible, as we know it, simply didn't fall out of the sky as a whole thing, right? There was the writing of individual books by individual authors, and these were gathered together over a period of, well, counting the Old Testament, hundreds of years, but the New Testament, as we'll see, a couple hundred years, really, to put all this together. Third reason this comes up is there's different philosophical and historical reconstructions, right? Everybody in the field of biblical studies is working with the same manuscripts and the same data, but there's different approaches and sort of theological assumptions, philosophical assumptions behind how things came together and why. That's often why you'll see some different interpretations of things. Who was involved in these processes and why were they doing what they're doing? So there's a bit of a kind of philosophical assumption going on there. Fourth, there are different theologies. As you'll see somewhat in the non-canonical Gospels like Thomas and Judas, there's a very different description of Jesus, what he did, what he said, compared to what you find in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So why is the Gospel of Judas describing Jesus this way? That's very different from what you see in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And the last reason, of course, we live in America. And people make money off of Jesus, to put it crassly. And when you want to put on a TV show, the only way to get people to watch it is to make it sound like it's something new and exciting and different. And you got to kind of play it up. There's different Bible translations, right? And they're marketed to different audiences. So we have different Bible versions and different Bible editions because we're in America and people make money on the Bible. So we're in a bit of an interesting cultural situation as well, where the Bible is not simply produced, let's say, by the church for use in the church. It's also produced to be sold on Amazon.com, right? Which means that that will affect somehow, in some ways, how it's marketed and how it's put together. So there's kind of lots of reasons coming together why this is more of an issue today than it was in the past, especially in our framework today. The thing I want to keep in mind as we go through this, however, is that throughout the entire process, people were involved in putting the Bible together. One of the things that really got me personally interested in biblical studies and manuscript studies in particular was when I was even in college, I was able to look at some second century manuscripts, firsthand in a library, and to realize that somebody 1,800 years ago sat down and produced, it was a copy of the Pauline letters, letter by letter, word by word, 1,800 years earlier. And you're sitting there a foot away from a document produced, by somebody just like me 1,800 years ago. And it's kind of an interesting experience just personally, but also the recognition that they're just like me, right? And if they're just like me, as they're making a copy, what's probably going to happen, right? They're going to make a mistake here and there. They're going to get tired. They're going to get a little bored here and there, right? I really like this particular manuscript. This is a 6th century Latin manuscript that I was working on a while back. And, you know, guy just got bored and drew a picture of his boss. So I don't know, who is it, right? It's his professor, Tim, right? You know, maybe it's a self-portrait, who knows? But it's just somebody is making a copy, right? And it's people just like you and me who were making copies year after year after year, century after century, down to our own day, right? So how did the church copy these? How did they pass them on? Why did they end up the way they did? And to recognize that this has been happening for 2,000 years. Right? So first, the different books in the New Testament. When Jesus came on the scene, there was not yet what we would call an Old Testament as a single book, right? You see this in Luke 4, where it's Jesus walking into his synagogue is described. And the text says, as was his custom, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, and then he quotes the prophet, right? Isaiah 40. Now notice, he's got a scroll of the prophet Isaiah. He doesn't have a Bible. He doesn't have the Old Testament. He has a scroll of a single book. Okay. When Jesus came around, first century, Jewish tradition was using scrolls to preserve its writings, its sacred writings. And essentially, this is what the Old Testament would have looked like at the time of Jesus. It's a bookcase with a bunch of scrolls in it, right? And so you got Isaiah, you've got Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, you've got the Book of the 12, the Minor Prophets. You've got a collection of scrolls. And see, how do you know which one is supposed to be, quote, in the Bible and which one is not? Right? It's a format question. You could put more on the shelf, take some off the shelf. It's not a physically defined object yet when Jesus shows up. And even in the early church, they weren't yet thinking of a book or a written teaching at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. So you see this well illustrated in Mark's gospel. Oops, skip back one. There we go. Mark 1:1, the beginning of the good news about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Now, some of your translations will say the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. But here, good news means the preaching, the gospel preaching about Jesus Christ, Son of God. Or in Mark 1:14, Jesus' first words in the Gospel of Mark. The time is fulfilled, the kingdom of God is here, repent and believe in the good news, meaning the preaching that he's come to bring. Or in Mark 8, this is Jesus talking about picking up your cross and following me. Whoever saves his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for me and the good news will save it. Okay. So the early church, Jesus' own ministry, isn't yet talking about a Bible, right? When it talks about gospel, it's talking about the good news of what God is doing in Christ. It's not until much later that the word gospel comes to mean a writing. All right. Can you give me a click? There we go. This is the Lindisfarne Gospels. It's an 8th century copy of the Latin Gospels, and it has the first Old English translation interlinear above the Latin, kind of word by word. And what I really like about this is the beginning of John's Gospel. It's obviously a beautiful object, right? I mean, somebody spent hours and hours and hours illuminating the Gospels, right? It's an indication of how precious they saw the Gospels, to spend this much time and really money to buy the ink to produce something like this. But if you look closely at the translation of the manuscript, there's the word evangelium in Latin, and above it is written in the kind of scratchy handwriting, the word God spell. You see that? God spell above it. Now that's not a 1970s Broadway musical, okay? That's the Old English word that literally means, God means good, and spell is speaking in Old English. So like a witch's spell, I mean, just the old word for speaking. So the Old English word God spell literally means good speaking or good news. Now in our modern English, we've cut out the D and now we just say gospel, and we've lost the understanding of good news. But that's what the word gospel originally meant. The good news, the good message, the good speaking, focused in Jesus. Later on, that came to mean a writing, right? The Gospel of Mark, Gospel of Matthew, Gospel of Luke. Now why is that important, right? Why is that important? Well, for the first several decades of the church's life, they didn't have written Gospels. They had Jesus teaching. They had the apostles sent out to teach and preach, right? Matthew 28, Acts 1, Luke 24. And they're producing writings based on this apostolic teaching, right? Based on this good news, okay? So gospel, in its original sense, refers to the message focused on Jesus Christ, and it doesn't yet mean a writing. When are the New Testament writings produced? Oops. Well, the Pauline epistles were written between the late 40s and the early 60s. Apostle Paul's ministry, at least writing, again, late 40s, perhaps the Thessalonians correspondence is the earliest, the early 60s, his imprisonment epistles. So over about a 15-year period, Paul is writing his letters. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there's some debate about when these are written. Some scholars will put them in the 60s into 70, some maybe slightly earlier. Other scholars will put them later into the 90s. There's some debate about exactly when, primarily because there's some debate about how it references the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. We don't need to talk a whole lot about that. The book of John, Revelation, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, generally dated into the 90s, so later. The Apostle John, probably the longest lived apostle. The other Catholic epistles, so Hebrews, James, Jude, some uncertainty about the date. Some might be as early as the 40s. Others are a little bit uncertain. But notice it's a pretty narrow window. Roughly between 40 and 100, you could put all the writings of the New Testament. And again, these are individual writings produced not as part of a collection of essays, to put it that way, but as individual writings. See, Mark is writing for what seems to be primarily a non-Jewish audience, probably from the Roman Empire, a broad audience. Matthew is probably writing for a Jewish audience. Reflects things that are more intelligible and understandable in a Jewish context. Luke, again, seems to be writing more for a Greek audience than a Jewish audience. So they're each writing for specific groups of people to explain this good news for that group of people. Paul's letters, of course, he's writing a letter to the church in Rome, a letter to the church in Corinth. There are 2 letters to the church in Corinth. So there's specific addressees or audiences for these writings, and they had to be collected together at some point to be brought into the New Testament. Right. So how did this happen? How did the Bible get built, to put it that way? So a few things to keep in mind again. What is the historical evidence that we have? I have to say there's the first couple of centuries of the church's life, there's not a lot of documents or textual evidence for what was happening. Right? The early church was a small community or small communities really spread around the Roman Empire. You didn't have the structures that you had later on. They obviously had communication with each other, but they're not a large set of groups interacting. And you certainly didn't have, say, in our Lutheran context, Concordia Publishing House that's cranking out a Lutheran study Bible for everybody to use. So there's not a lot of actual textual data from the first couple of centuries, but there is some. So we do have some references in other writings to New Testament writings already beginning in about the year 100. We start to see, there's a pastor in Rome, for example, who writes a letter, and he references 5 of the Pauline epistles already in the year 100. So there seems to be some use of Paul's letters already by 100 in a specific author. But sometimes it's a little bit uncertain, right? Sometimes when they're quoting, say, Matthew, or what looks like Matthew, are they quoting it as part of the Bible, or are they quoting it because they're remembering something Jesus said? Right? So there's a little bit of debate sometimes about what they're using. The second piece of evidence is, when did they start listing books? So when did they start putting tables of contents together? Well, that would be a pretty good piece of evidence, but they don't really start doing that until the 4th century, where you start to see lists of books, either in writings or in manuscripts. Another good piece of evidence would be, when did they start using it in worship? So when did they start preaching from the New Testament? That would be a pretty good indication that it's part of the Bible, right? Just like Jesus unrolls Isaiah and says, today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. Again, there's no lists or clear textual evidence for use in worship until about the 4th century. And a fourth piece of evidence, and the one that's my favorite, because it's my favorite, is the manuscripts themselves. What do the actual copies tell us about what's in the Bible and how they're putting it together? And it's actually, in many ways, some of the earliest evidence, because we have manuscripts that date into the 2nd century that have New Testament writings. So again, no matter what the theory is of how the New Testament came together or what you see on TV, there's really only so much data there is to deal with, right? And that's why sometimes you'll see different interpretations, or sometimes you'll see people claim that the Bible did not come together until the 4th century, right? And that there's 300 years, quote unquote, of uncertainty. Well, that's true in a sense, that it's not until the 4th century that you start to see lists like a table of contents that we have today, all right? But there is other evidence that shows how these same writings were used consistently prior to the 4th century. So while that's true that we don't see it all in one spot until the 4th century, there's other evidence that shows its use ahead of time. One of the challenges is, again, as I mentioned, there's not much physical evidence out there. Manuscript material is either papyrus early on or later on parchment. Papyrus is it's actually a really nice material. It was mass-produced in the ancient world. It's sort of like really thick, really nice paper. I mean, you can still buy papyrus today, and it's very expensive. The problem with it, though, is it has to stay dry and it has to stay out of the light. As soon as it gets wet, it falls apart because it's organic material, and as soon as it turns up in the light, it darkens and crumbles. So the only place that papyrus has been preserved is from Egypt, from desert locations that never got wet and remained under the sand, literally. A lot of our biblical material today actually comes from a site called Oxyrhynchus on the Nile River, which was a village in the ancient world that they eventually just slightly moved and literally left a garbage dump behind. And a lot of our biblical materials come from that. So here's a picture of, if I can flip ahead. There we go. Oops. One more. There. This is about 100 years ago, a little bit more, and they're literally sifting sand and finding documents in the sand. And they found all kinds of things. They found letters, they found legal documents, and they found some pieces of biblical material. Some of it, most of it pretty small, some of it fairly large. But that's one of the challenges, is that all of our evidence, physical evidence for the New Testament prior to the year 300 comes from Egypt. So we don't have a picture of what was going on in, say, France or Rome or Asia Minor because it's too wet. Material isn't preserved. So that's one limiting challenge. What did these look like physically? And again, this is fairly common for us. They're producing these in what's called a codex. Now again, a scroll was the common form of the Jewish scriptures and of pretty much any ancient literary writing. So if you have a writing of, let's say, Julius Caesar, or a writing of Plato or Aristotle, those are always going to be produced on scrolls in the ancient world. And what's handy about a scroll is you can see how it's made. You just take a sheet and you write in columns, and if you want to add more, you stitch on another sheet and you keep going, stitch on another sheet, you keep going, stitch on another sheet, you keep going, right? You can make scrolls fairly large, actually. With a book, with a codex, again, you've got folded pages, and once you sew it together, you're done, right? And there's a physical limitation as to the size. Now, what's really interesting in the New Testament is every Christian writing that exists today is in codex form. They consistently used a book for copies of the Gospels, the Pauline epistles, everything, where all other ancient literature is written on scrolls. It's a vast difference. It's like the rest of the world is using a PC and Christians are using Macs, or take your pick, whichever side you like better. But they're using a different technology for their writings, and there's some debate about why this is. But very early on, Christians began using books, codices, for their writings. And it's easy to tell which is a scroll and which is a codex, because a scroll, even if you have a small piece, only has writing on one side. Obviously, you unroll it. Whereas a book, you're going to have writing on two sides. So you can figure out what's going on. So physically, what did this look like? This is well, you can see the middle there. This is a codex, a book of several writings, including some Catholic epistles. And you can see down the center there where it would have been folded and the little hole where it would have been stitched together. Okay, so that's a book. So Christians very early on adopted something that looks very similar to what we use as the Bible today, whereas in Judaism, they didn't start using codices until about 1,000 years later. They're using scrolls, well, the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, and literary texts, Hellenistic historians, Latin writers, they're all using scrolls. Why do they do this? Again, it's an interesting question. Here's some of the stats we can kind of skim over. But one pretty good theory, the one I prefer anyway, there's several theories, and there's no church voters meeting minutes to tell us what they were doing or why they were doing it. But one theory is that this was adopted from Paul's notebooks. There's a passage in 2 Timothy 4, that's one of these sort of throwaway lines that you don't really, well, pastors probably never preach on it. But Paul's writing to Timothy, he says, "When you come, bring the cloak which I left at Troas with Carpus, and ta Biblia, and especially tas membranas." So bring the Biblia. Biblia is the Greek word for notebooks, right? But what does that sound like in English? Bible, right? Notebooks are what you kept your notes on, right? Your backup copies. It's your school lessons. You didn't use notebooks for literary texts for reading. You use them for notebooks. Well, and then the second, tas membranas, well, that's membranes, parchments, that's your scrolls. So what Paul is saying to Timothy, bring the notebooks and especially the scrolls. So what Paul is saying to Timothy is, bring my copies of the Old Testament, the membranas, the scrolls, and bring my Biblia, my notebooks, which might well be a reference to his backup copies of his letters, right? So when Paul writes a letter to, say, Galatia, he sends a copy off, and you don't have UPS, you don't have FedEx, you don't have guaranteed delivery, right? You give it to somebody and hope they deliver it. And if they don't, you keep a backup copy just in case, and you keep a backup copy because it's just what you do anyway. So what Paul is probably saying here is bring my flash drive, right, my backups, and bring my scrolls. And this might well be the reason that early Christians adopted the Codex, because one of the earliest evidences for collecting the New Testament writings together is this collection of the Pauline epistles. So did that become the model for the rest of the New Testament, that they adopted a new format because that's what Paul was using? Well, it's possible. There's a pretty good case for that. A lot of scholars think that might be the case. But whatever the reason, early on, Christians were using books, again, that you could not add to. Once you bind a book, and I don't have one up here, once you bind a book, you're done, right? You can't add to it. It's fixed. It's finished, right? And so it's at least a factor in how they're selecting what ends up in the New Testament and why some and not others. What's the format they're using? There's actually a range of handwriting styles in the ancient world. If you look at the one on the left, it looks a little bit more kind of chicken scratchy, right? Whereas the one on the right is much more elegant, larger letters, spaces between the lines, much easier to read. I'll ask one of the pastors, since they know Greek, right? Who knows Greek? Anybody want to volunteer? Tim does, right? Which one would you rather read out loud?
The one on the right.
One on the right, yeah, obviously. The one on the right is actually older than the one on the left. It's a copy of John, chapter 7 and 8 here, and seems pretty clearly written to be read from out loud. It's large letters, easy to read. The one on the left looks less likely to be used for public reading, probably a more personal copy. Then you get to something like this, and it's shows up, right? Can you click it for me? Yeah. Again, probably used for public reading, nice round letters. So you can tell somewhat what they're being used for just based on the handwriting style. And you start to see the Gospels and Paul's letters copied with this more elegant handwriting style pretty early on, as opposed to some more personal or non-literary texts. Another factor in pulling all this together is the way they copied the manuscripts. Early on, they didn't use spaces, punctuation by and large. There's no chapter divisions, verse divisions, all that stuff comes later on. This is the beginning of John's Gospel here in a manuscript dated to about the year 200. And it just runs straight through. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. God was with the Word in the beginning. So just the beginning of John's Gospel, but it just runs straight through, right? No chapters, no verses, no commentary, just straight text. How did they start to put this together then, chronologically? Well, the first period, basically in the first century, you have the Hebrew Scriptures in Greek translation being used by the church, used for early teaching and preaching. When the Apostle Paul cites the Old Testament, he's almost always citing it in translation in the Greek from the Hebrew, okay? So he's not actually going back to the Hebrew and translating as he goes. He's quoting a Greek translation that already existed when he quotes the Old Testament, which is kind of interesting, right? Already, the early church is using a translation of the Old Testament right from the get-go, okay? But that's functionally the Bible of the early Christians, right? The Apostle Paul is quoting the Old Testament. Jesus is quoting the Old Testament. They're all quoting the Old Testament as the Bible, and of course preaching the good news from that. In the first century, as I said, they're producing Christian writings, some of which eventually became what we now call the New Testament. Okay, so there are other writings being produced in the first century by Christians that didn't end up in the New Testament. The second period, roughly the end of the 1st century into the 2nd century, is when they start to gather these writings together into collections. And this would have been in 2 sets of books. First, you have the 4 canonical Gospels as one codex, one book, and the 13 Pauline epistles as another book, a second book. Interestingly, the 4 Gospels is about as much text as you can get into a papyrus codex. There's a size limitation to it. You can kind of stretch, and there's one manuscript that does put Acts in there with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but it's produced separately and kind of stitched on, and it's obviously a kind of an expansion. But essentially, the largest you can physically make a papyrus codex book is about the size of the 4 Gospels. So the earliest New Testament would be Paul's letters, 4 Gospels, right? The third period, 4th and 5th centuries, is where you start to have, again, lists, formalized decisions, and the shift to using parchment rather than papyrus, which you can make much larger pages and put more together so you can get a bigger book. And now you could get not only the whole New Testament under one cover, but the Old Testament could also be included in one big, large book. So this tracks through, these 3 periods track through both what we can see from early church fathers quoting the New Testament. We can see this in the manuscripts. There's a corresponding track where these same writings are being copied and used pretty consistently for the first couple hundred years. A couple of examples. The early church faced a lot of persecution, of course. Some of it was local. Eventually, by the time you get to the 4th century, there's very widespread persecution throughout the empire. But here in 180, there's a persecution that breaks out, and the early church was very interested to preserve what happened. They wrote down what was happening during these persecutions, and it's interesting to read these today. You can find them on the internet, but in 180, there's this description of what happened when the Roman official came looking for the books. So here, Saturninus, the proconsul, says to Speratus, who's a Christian, do you persist in being a Christian? Speratus says, I am a Christian. And with him, they all agreed. So everybody said, yep, he's a Christian, right? Saturninus, the proconsul, said, will you have a space to consider? That is, will you change your mind? And Speratus says, in a matter so straightforward, there's no considering. He's like, I'm a Christian, right? Saturninus, the proconsul, said, what are the things in your bag? So he's got his backpack, right, or whatever he has. And Speratus says, books and epistles of Paul, a just man. So notice it's a set of Paul's letters here in 180 that Speratus has here in Numidia in North Africa. Okay. A book of Paul's letters as his, well, he doesn't say it's the New Testament, but he's carrying it around, and it's collected together as a single book. This is the, whoops, go back one if you could. This is a manuscript of Paul's letters from about the year 200. Go back, there we go. Papyrus number 46. This is what got me interested in all this stuff in the first place. It's the end of Romans and the beginning of it's the end of Hebrews and the beginning of 1 Corinthians. It's a little bit of an oddball. But nicely copied, professionally produced, a good scribe, and it's a collection of Paul's letters dated to about the year 200. So this is our earliest extant version, you might say, of Paul's letters that we have in existence today to about the year 200. It's a pretty cool manuscript. The second book is the 4 Gospels, and there's a little some interesting evidence that points to how these were collected together. The 4 Gospels were probably collected together by about the year 150, from what we can tell, based on a few bits of evidence. First, they have uniform titles. So this manuscript right here dates to about 200, maybe a couple decades earlier. So let's say 180 to 200. And you can see already Evangelion, let me get a pointer up here. Evangelion, oh, it doesn't point. Oops, go back one. Kata Lukan and Evangelion Kata Ioane. So the good news according to Luke, followed by the good news according to John, right? Luke and John write one into the other. So you have the four Gospels collected together into a single book, and notice they're given the same title, right? Luke doesn't give a title to his book. John doesn't give a title to his book. Somebody, we don't know who, gave the same title to the four Gospels when they were collected together. So you have the Gospel according to Matthew, the Gospel according to Mark, the Gospel according to Luke, the Gospel according to John. Somebody gave them a uniform title, each, all when they're collected together. Now we don't know who, we don't know why, but in the earliest manuscripts, this is seen already consistently, these titles. Interestingly, as you know, skip to the next one. Luke wrote Luke and Acts as a two-part, part one, part two, former book, second book, right? However, in the manuscripts, Luke and Acts are never copied together. Acts is almost always copied either by itself or with the Pauline epistles or Catholic epistles, and Luke is copied with Matthew, Mark, and John. So interestingly, Luke sort of didn't get his way in the manuscripts, right? They said, oh, great gospel, Luke. We're going to put the gospel with Matthew, Mark, and John, and Acts we're going to put over here, right? And they brought Luke into this four-gospel codex separate from Acts, which is an interesting move, right? Again, somebody is deciding to put these together with a uniform, consistent format. And finally, you see references in early theologians to these four Gospels. So by 160, you see a theologian named Justin Martyr talking about the three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and weaving them together into a single narrative. In about 180, you see Irenaeus in France talking about the four Gospels which were handed down to us. About 190, a theologian in Alexandria, Clement in Egypt, talks about the four Gospels which were handed down to us, right? Very consistent phrase. There's another theologian, Serapion in Asia Minor, about 200, who talks about the four Gospels which were handed down to us. So you see in different parts of the Roman Empire, they start describing the four Gospels in the same way as those that were handed down to us, which means that they're probably, a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades earlier. These were collected together, and so generally by 150, we can see that there's this four gospel book collected together. Now, why is that important, right? First, John's gospel is generally dated to about the year 100, 95, 100. So within a couple of generations, you've got John, Matthew, Mark, Luke together as a book. So pretty quickly, right? So fairly early on. Second, again, they're pulling these together and using them pretty consistently as a coherent book before other writings are produced which are now coming to light, like Gospel of Judas or Gospel of Mary, right? Already by the middle of the 2nd century, you have these four Gospels singled out and brought together into a single book. We talked about titles. All right, let me skip over this next slide here. There's Luke and John. All right. Now, what about these other Gospels? What about these other Gospels? So, Gospel of Judas, Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Philip, these things that are kind of hitting the news. Most of these were discovered beginning in the mid-20th century as these finds from Egypt began to be excavated and these new texts discovered. Okay, again, it's archaeologically when they came to light. What's interesting, though, is that they start to use the word gospel in a grammatically and well, just a different meaning, right? So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the phrase is the gospel according to Luke, Evangelion kata Lukan, right? When you get to the gospel of Judas, it's called literally the gospel of Judas, or another way to translate that would be the gospel by Judas, or the gospel of Thomas, similarly, skip there. These are the sacred sayings that the living Jesus spoke and Didymus Judas Thomas recorded. Okay, so gospel of Thomas. Now, why is that important, right? When you have the gospel of or by Judas or the gospel by Thomas, at that point you have the word gospel meaning a book, a writing, right? A book by somebody. When you have gospel according to Luke, gospel according to John, gospel according to Mark, how many gospels are there? Now, this is kind of a trick question. Pastors can't answer. Yeah, there's one gospel, right? There's gospel, and this one is told by Matthew. There's one gospel, and this one is told by Mark, right? So you go from the gospel being the message about or the message according to someone to now it being a book, okay? Again, these are all written after the time of the collecting together of the four gospels into a single book. All right. So there's a shift already in the 2nd century that marks these off as distinct and unique. There is not a single manuscript that ever puts Thomas, Philip, Judas, whatever other gospel, in the same book as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Right? So there's a distinction. Right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are copied and used as one group. The other gospels are produced and used by other people for different purposes. They're always copied separately and distinctly. All right, so there's Gospel of Judas. You can see there at the end there. Let's skip over this. Oh, go back. There's also some consistent features that tie these manuscripts together. Certain words are always abbreviated in a certain way consistently in every manuscript. The 4 words being God, Jesus, Christ, and Lord. They're called sacred names, holy names, nomina sacra, and every manuscript will abbreviate these in a certain way. And you can see, if you see the manuscript that there, again, the pointer doesn't work, but you see the bars above certain words. What they would do is abbreviate the word and put a bar over it as a way to highlight that these 4 words are holy or sacred. And notice it's God, Lord, Jesus, Christ, right? Your key words. Every Christian manuscript does this. Not every single one from the very beginning. So there's a shared practice, right, consistently across all the manuscripts that you see very early on that puts these together in a similar collection, a similar set of writings. So this is, again, from around the year 200, and already they're reflecting this consistent practice. I'll put this one up for Pastor Cook because this is what he did his thesis on. There's 2193, and Pastor Cook could tell you exactly what that says, right?
Yes. Christ, the Son of God.
There you go. The Christ, the Son of God, right? John 20. So you see the bar above the what looks like the S and the circle, above the I and the circle, and above the theta and the U, right? Use nomina sacra. Now this is, what is it, 11th century, Tim? 10th century. So 900 years later, they're still using the same abbreviations consistently across the manuscripts. All right, let me do a couple more things here, and then we'll, So as they're collecting them together, what are some of the theological issues involved? And I'll pick on the Gospel of Judas here just because I can. And it's a pretty interesting text. Let me give you a minute here, and then we'll stand up. The Gospel of Judas, here's how it's titled: The Secret Account of the Revelation that Jesus Spoke in Conversation with Judas Iscariot during the week 3 days before he celebrated the Passover. Okay. the content of the writings, of this writing, is pretty interesting. This came out in 2007, this manuscript, and it was released on National Geographic Channel. It was a big special. It was actually Palm Sunday of 2007, which just happened to be my birthday, so I remember it. The big press on this was that we now have new insights into Jesus' ministry, right? Gospel of Judas. Well, after it was published and you could actually read it, you discover that the content of the writing is actually an anti-Christian polemic. It's an anti-Christian writing which makes fun of the Christians. There's a description of the Lord's Supper, and the disciples are depicted as buffoons and idiots and not really understanding Jesus' teaching. Judas is highlighted as the guy who has all the writings. So of course, who are you going to pick as the kind of ironic character, right? It's an anti-Jewish writing, which would be strange if it's actually by Jesus or accounts for Jesus because he's Jewish. So it's written in the mid to late 2nd century as an anti-Christian writing, almost a satirical writing. And it's copied by itself. It's not collected together with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So it's produced by a separate group of people who aren't getting along with the Christians and not used canonically, not used in worship, not thought of as something that was representative of going back to the ministry of Jesus at all, but a later writing that's against the Christians. Now, give me a minute here, and then we'll take a break. As these are being compiled, we have to keep in mind that the church still had the apostles and the followers of the apostles as all this is happening. So, let me skip a couple of slides here. Can you get to Papias, the scary-looking guy? There. He is kind of scary-looking, right? Now, Papias is an interesting character. He's a pastor in a town called Hierapolis, which is a main trade center in Eastern Asia Minor, and he's alive in 110 AD. And he's somebody who knew the Apostle John face to face, right? So here we are, 80 years after Jesus' ministry, and he knows the Apostle John personally, right? And he writes about what he did as he's, again, on this, he's on the interstate, and people pass through, and he asks some questions, right? What's going on? What actually happened? And he says, I shall not hesitate also to put into properly ordered form for you everything I learned carefully in the past from the elders and noted down well, for the truth of which I vouch. For unlike most people, I did not enjoy those who have a great deal to say, but those who teach the truth. And if by chance anyone who had been in attendance on the elders, that is, a follower of the apostles, should come my way, I inquired about the words of the elders, what Andrew or Peter said, or Philip, or Thomas, or James, or John, or Matthew, or any of the other of the Lord's disciples said, and whatever Aristion and the elder John, the Lord's disciples, were saying. Notice that's a present tense, were saying. For I did not think that information from books would profit me as much as information from a living and surviving voice. That's an interesting comment, right? Nowadays, we tend to trust books and mistrust people, right? But in the ancient world, you trust people because you can check what they're saying, you can check their lifestyle, you can, you know them. And a book, well, that could be mistakes, it can be fake, right? But here's Papias in the year 110, and he's able to talk to people who knew the apostles. He could check what they're saying. And this is when they're gathering these writings, checking these writings. And so they're not just sort of picking these gospels out of thin air. The church still has people who knew the apostles and could verify what was being said and was this actually accurate 80 years after Jesus' time. So again, it's not like, let's say in the middle of the 2nd century, somebody sat down and said, hey, let's make a New Testament. Let's see what books are out there, and then we'll get a voters meeting together, and we'll decide what's going to be in the New Testament. Right? No, it's not what happened. They have these writings produced by people they knew. They could check with the apostles themselves or the disciples of the apostles, and they could verify that this was in fact correct. Right? So again, it's not coming together in a vacuum. The New Testament is coming together in an active church which was continuously teaching the message and could verify and check the writings against people who were actually there, or at least followers of those who were actually there. All right, let me stop there. I'm a few minutes over, and it's kind of a lot. Let me give you a chance to ask any questions just on this basic putting together things in the first couple centuries. Yeah.
So when the Catholic Church says that in Catholic Dixie, they put the Bible together, is that accurate?
That they, the Catholic Church, put the Bible together?
Correct.
Well, so officially they did in the Council of Trent in the 1540s. So previous to this, there's actually not any documentation that there's a church council that voted on the books. There's letters that talk about things, there's discussions about certain books, but there's no official church council that votes on this. So when you get to the Reformation, you get Luther and others, William Tyndale, John Calvin, right? Other theologians at the time of the Reformation debating which books are actually authentic and which ones are not. And the Roman Catholic Church says, well, no, you Protestants are wrong. The church gets to decide, and we're going to say that these writings are authoritative, right? And that included what we now call the Apocrypha. So that's when the Roman Catholic Church kind of officially put their stamp on what the Bible is. They also at the same time declared that you have to use the Latin translation, not even the Greek and Hebrew, but the Latin. And still to this day they have translations of the Latin that they use as their text. Now, again, that's not what we have documented from the earliest period. It seems to be a much more organic process that these Gospels were used, collected together, and then continued to be used for the next 1,300 years until we got to the printing press. Yeah. Any other questions just on the basic gathering? Yeah?
So you heard the Dead Sea Scrolls now, is that all repeats?
The Dead Sea Scrolls, good. Dead Sea Scrolls are all Hebrew, well, I shouldn't say that. The Dead Sea Scrolls are famous for being the earliest copies of the Hebrew Old Testament, Hebrew Scriptures. There's some other writings also, some Jewish writings from that time period that were previously unknown. But what they're most famous for is the Jewish writings. They date generally from 200 BC to the first half of the 1st century AD. And they were discovered in caves south of Jerusalem, the Dead Sea area, which again, caves are dark and dry. If anybody been to Israel, it's hotter than heck down there, and it's very dry. So that's why they got preserved, and they were discovered in the late 1940s. So they really have nothing to do with the New Testament, except they show us a little bit about what Judaism was like at the time of Jesus and just before. But there's no New Testament material in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's all Old Testament if it's biblical material, and it's in Hebrew.
So we've pretty much been through all of that.
Yeah, all the Dead Sea Scrolls have been published, studied. There are some excavations still going on down there, but in fact there was one just a year ago, but they didn't find anything new. There might well be some other caves that haven't yet been discovered, but chances are, it's been 60, 70 years. They've picked it over pretty well, and it's pretty unlikely that they're going to find new material. I mean, some people think they might, but chances are they found what they're going to find. All right, why don't we stand up and take a quick say hi to your neighbor break, stretch out for a second.